Mark Prendergast here. I'm the director and founder of Safe Drone Academy. A lot of flying background in the manned aircraft world. I've been a civilian and commercial pilot and a military pilot. I have a lot of flying experience from a user point of view using unmanned aircraft. I've set up Safe Drone Academy, and I've worked with Brussels-based European Cockpit Association dealing with European UAS regulation. So I have a good background in that. Currently I'm a member of the UAS Advisory Council to the Irish Aviation Authority. And as you said, when I'm not flying drones, I'm flying the larger aircraft with Aer Lingus as a captain. So I guess that sets the tone of who I am and why I'm here delivering this handbook to you and this webinar. So today it's all about the handbook. So this will be launched today, and Alexandra has already indicated you'll receive a link to it. And in this handbook, I've tried to, in a conversational tone, try to synopsize and explain the European regulatory regulations. Okay, and this webinar is going to briefly go through the contents of the handbook and try and explain to you today some of the elements within the handbook that you should be aware of and that you should be aware of from a regulation point of view. So a little disclaimer on the handbook as always. So it is a guide and it's not intended to be a replacement for a reading of the UAS regulations. So you should always reference the regulatory documents themselves before making decisions. So I like to introduce these webinars by, with this slide. So just because you have a hammer doesn't make you a builder, okay? And likewise, just because you have a drone and you're running a drone operation doesn't mean that you're going to competently be able to use that drone tool to get the data that you need to use or that you hope to acquire. So you need competent people operating that tool. But unlike a lot of tools in your toolbox, the drone tool comes with a lot of regulatory competency and a lot of regulatory requirements. So you're going to need to put good people and get them educated and trained up and create awareness around the regulations. And this handbook is designed to help in that regard. So where we are currently under, or we were previously under the Irish regulatory situation, and we had the Irish Aviation Authority's Regulation SI 563 of 2015, and a lot of local authorities out there would have used those regulations to stand up a drone operation. But that regulation is now been discontinued because we are now under a European regulatory situation. So the European Commission have adopted European regulation when it comes to unmanned aircraft. And these regulations were published in 2019, but mostly only came into force on the 1st of January of 2021. Now, throughout 2021, those of you with permissions to operate drones under the Irish system may have been able to continue using your Irish permissions this year, so 2021, but that will cease to be the case come the end of this year. So the 31st of December, all Irish permissions given out under the old Irish system will cease to exist, and you'll be fully under the auspices of the European Commission rules. So the European Commission brought out a package of regulation, actually, two independent but interlinked regulations. So Regulation 947 is also known as the Implementing Act, and this is essentially the rules of the Air Act. So all the limitations that you're supposed to fly your drone under will be contained inside the Regulation 947. Whereas Regulation 945, known as the Delegated Act, this regulation kind of sets out new technical standards for unmanned aircraft, particularly small unmanned aircraft. So those unmanned aircraft must be designed to certain technical standards, and we'll have a little bit more on that later on. Now, they are EU rules, so they're applicable across the EU, including Norway and Iceland. And the regulations, what they do is they standardize the rules now. So we're all flying to the same limitations, no matter what EU country you're in. The regulations are also harmonized, which means that a registration or a remote pilot certificate or a permission to operate unmanned aircraft issued in one EU member state is valid in the next. So this adheres to the EU policy of the single market. And the regulations are quite detailed and they're quite broad and expansive in terms of areas covered. And that's to allow the UAS industry in Europe to grow and realise its potential. So they're necessarily complex in certain areas, and they certainly allow or provide a pathway to operations that previously national regulations wouldn't really have catered for. One thing to point out, particularly to local authorities that might conduct cross-border operations in Northern Ireland, if you are operating in Northern Ireland or Great Britain, your European your European permissions and pilot certificates won't actually be valid up in Northern Ireland or Great Britain. So you will have to train and get permissions under the UK system, and that's as a result of Brexit. Now, who's in charge? So at the very top, we have the European Commission. They're the ones that have issued the regulations and adopted them into law. There is a European Aviation Safety Agency, which is a European aviation body formulated or brought into force under European regulations. They're the European Commission's expert body when it comes to aviation matters in Europe. So EASA, they had a lot of input into the regulations that were then issued by the European Commission. So EASA is an agency that if you continue to operate drones under the European system, you'll become very familiar with that agency. At a national level, we still have across the EU all our national authorities. So in Ireland, we have the Irish Aviation Authority, and their role now basically is to implement and administer the European rules and indeed enforce them. Now, if you look through the handbook when it's issued to you, you'll see the first few sections cover the areas that I've just spoken about there. But section 6, I introduced the regulatory concept of the categories of operation. And essentially, the regulations, when they look at unmanned aircraft operations, they don't really care who or why an operation is being conducted. So there's no differentiation between recreational flying and commercial flying. What they really care about is what type of operation is being conducted and where is it being conducted. So the regulations really focus on the risk, the overall risk of the operation. The higher the risk of the operation, the more regulatory oversight that must be adhered to. Now, the main risks that they're talking about or they're concerned about are the air risk and the ground risk. So air risk, what exposure, what harm does your drone operation expose manned aircraft to? Okay, and then the ground risk is your operation going to expose members of the public who aren't involved with the operation? What harm will they be exposed to? So members of the public being those people walking around, going about their daily life, but also including those people in vehicles. So we can't forget them. So where your operation is a higher air risk or a higher ground risk class, well then the level of regulatory oversight will increase. Now, so Regulation 947, which again is the kind of the rules of the air for unmanned aircraft, it breaks the industry down into 3 major categories. So we have the open category, the specific category, and the certified category. So the open category is further subdivided into A1, A2, and A3, and I'll talk about that later on. But essentially, the open category is a low-risk category of operations. So the operations conducted in the open category will be low risk, whereas specific category is kind of medium to high risk operations, and then certified category will be the highest risk of operation. Now, briefly on the certified category, I don't really cover it in the handbook too much because right now it really only exists on paper. And if you want to fly in the certified category, you're going to have to basically implement manned aircraft regulations. So certified category really, it only caters for, or will cater for, moving passengers around in unmanned aircraft or delivering dangerous goods in unmanned aircraft. So not really an operation that most local authorities, I would expect, will be engaging in, at least at this point in time. So moving on then to section 7, there is a concept that local authorities are going to have to come to terms with, and it is that the regulations break the industry into 2 types of entities. We've got UAS operators and remote pilots. Now, a UAS operator is always a natural person or a legal person. So a natural person, an example would be a sole trader or recreational pilot, and a legal person will be a legal business like a limited company or a government agency or a state body of some sort. Okay, so in the context of this webinar and in the handbook, you should look to your local authority as being a legal person operator. And the operator's main function is to manage the unmanned aircraft operation. So to purchase all the equipment, make sure all the remote pilots are trained, to make sure that procedures are safe and legal, and that essentially the operation is being conducted in a legal manner. Now, someone needs to adopt the responsibilities for the operator, and this person is referred to as the accountable manager. And it would be expected that the accountable manager would be someone from a headquarter element, the CEO or equivalent. And the accountable manager's role essentially is to ensure that the regulatory responsibilities outlined within the regulations are met and achieved. The remote pilot then is a different entity. It is the natural person that is responsible for the unmanned aircraft or the drone when it's flying, when it's airborne. So this person is responsible for managing the flying operation of such, making sure that when the aircraft is in flight, the operation is being conducted in a safe and a legal manner. And again, the regulations would define specific responsibilities to the remote pilot that would be distinct from the UAS operator. So essentially what the regulations are defining, they're defining an organogram a bit like this. So at the top level, you have the local authority, so Dublin City Council or Meath County Council, whatever the local authority is, responsible then for the oversight of the operation, and an accountable manager is an appointed person that makes sure those responsibilities are being met. Then employees of the local authority are essentially then the remote pilots. And when they're on the ground flying the aircraft, they're responsible for ensuring that the flight is safe and legal at all times. But both entities have different responsibilities defined within the regulation. Now, Section 8 then of the handbook, it looks to one particular operator responsibility, and that is of operator registration. So registration is a feature of the regulations, and it's a security and safety function of the regulations, really. And all UAS operators, so Dublin City Council, for example, must register with the Aviation Authority, register the operation as such with the Aviation Authority. And when that is completed, the authority, once registered, will be given a registration number. That's a European registration number. The first three letters identify Ireland as the issuing member state. And this registration number must then be affixed to all the aircraft that the local authority uses when conducting its operations. So the same number will be affixed to the airframe of every single aircraft. And this number identifies that operator, so that local authority, as a legal user of unmanned aircraft. So it's the local authority itself that will register. So Dublin City Council, Meath County Council, Cork County Council, whichever the local authority is, that authority must be a registered operator of unmanned aircraft. And this is an example of a responsibility that is outlined under an operator responsibility. So it's something that the accountable manager would need to put in place. Now, registration was a feature of the Irish regulation, and just to give you the difference, under the old Irish regulations, it was the actual aircraft that you were flying that were individually registered. Okay, now that registration process has been discontinued. So any registration details you have on aircraft today should be removed. Okay, because we're now under the EU registration process, which means that the local authority has to register as a UAS operator. Now, Section 9 is a policy that the IAA have brought out in relation to local authorities. They refer to local authorities and similar agencies as complex organisations. So they're under the EU system. it is the local authority that must register and become a UAS operator, which is quite different from the old Irish system. Under the old Irish system, it was possible for a department within a local authority to kind of independently go out, get a permission from the aviation authority to operate unmanned aircraft or drones, register their own individual drones, and conduct their own operations independent of the rest of the local authority. So you'd have sections like the fire brigade section, the survey, mapping, environmental sections, and so on within the various local authorities. That can't exist under the new EU systems because an operator, remember, has to be a natural person or a legal person. And it's the county council itself or the local authority itself that is the legal person. So the legal person takes on all the responsibilities for managing the operation. Now, this is quite difficult for a local authority to put in place, and the IAA realised this and recognise it. And in fairness to them, they've brought out a policy and a procedure that local authorities should engage with to ensure that they are completely legal under the EU system, but somewhat mirror the old system that used to be in place. So a local authority management will have to engage with the IAA, and then they can adopt the IAA's policy, which would still see the local authority register as a UAS operator, and an accountable manager will be appointed to manage the overall oversight of the local authority's operation. But their process, the IAA's process, does allow a parent and sub-entity system set up. It does allow that system to operate. So the accountable manager, rather than managing the entirety of the local authorities' diverse operations, it can devolve, like under the old Irish system, some responsibility down to the various departments within the local authority. And the IAA will then, or someone will be designated to the IAA as a responsible person for those sub-entities. So the accountable manager role will still be there, and the local authority will still be the UAS operator from a legal point of view, but there will be a process through this complex organisation structure that the IAA have set up of allowing some autonomy for the departments where some of the operator responsibilities can be taken care of by a UAS responsible person at the department level or the sub-entity level. So it really is important that local authorities engage with the IAA in this. The IAA will then manually set up this structure for you within their systems, and you can then go on and do the legal responsibilities of registering the local authority of as a UAS operator, and then the various sub-entities can go on and start registering themselves as operators and then applying for separate independent authorizations from the authority to use unmanned aircraft. So within the guidebook, there's a section 9 will deal with that, and you'll see the link to this guidance document. If you haven't already seen it, the link will be in that handbook, and it'll link you to the IAA's policy document on this. But really, it's very important that local authorities engage with this process, because if they don't, you'll be unable to register as an operator, and that will mean potentially local authority unmanned aircraft operations will have to cease on the 1st of January 22 until this process has been adopted. So an important section there, section 9. Now, another concept introduced with the regulations is that of C-marked aircraft and legacy aircraft, and I cover this in section 10. So regulation 945 introduced the concept of C-marked aircraft. Okay, and what this is the regulation outlines minimum technical specifications that small unmanned aircraft that we're using today must meet. Up to this, there's been no regulatory guidance or documentation for what technical standards small unmanned aircraft must meet. So Regulation 945 addresses this problem, and it defines a number of different standards. And if a manufacturer designs an aircraft that meets a technical standard, it can affix one of these labels. They go from 0 to 6. So depending on the technical standards that are met, you can affix one of these labels to the aircraft. And this is very important for open category operations, because essentially the regulations want the open category to be flown by operators using aircraft that meet these technical standards, so that are operated using drones that meet the C-marked standard. Okay. Some low-risk operations of the specific category might also be required to operate using a C-marked aircraft, C-Mark 5 or C-Mark 6. The problem with this C-marking system is that, as I'm speaking today, December 2021, no C-marked aircraft are available on the market, and there's no timeline or vision on when they will be available. So at the very earliest, a guess would be that we might see C-marked aircraft at around the end of 2022. Regulation also then defines another type of aircraft known as legacy unmanned aircraft, and these basically have no C marking on them. So these are the aircraft that we're flying today, so that local authorities are flying today. The DJI Mavics and Phantoms and the Autel Evo aircraft that you're flying today, they are referred to in the regulation as legacy unmanned aircraft. So they don't have these C markings because they don't meet the technical specifications that are outlined in the regulation. Now, the problem with legacy unmanned aircraft, particularly when it comes to open category operations, is that essentially the regulations want to get rid of legacy aircraft as such, or definitely limit their use. And so legacy aircraft are limited by Articles 22 and Articles 20 of the regulations. Now, Article 22 essentially says that until the 1st of January 2023, you may operate a legacy unmanned aircraft in the various subcategories of the open category based on the aircraft's weight. So if it's less than 500 grams, you could operate it in open A3. If it's between 500 grams and less than 2 kg, you could operate it in open A2. And 500 to less than 25 kg, you could operate it in open A3. There's an asterisk there for open A2 because the pilot additionally needs some extra competency before they can fly. After the 1st of January 23, though, Article 20 takes over. And in this article, it basically says that in open category A1, you can only fly a legacy unmanned aircraft if it weighs less than 250 grams. All other open category operations with legacy aircraft will be restricted to open A3. So that is definitely something to keep in mind when it comes to legacy unmanned aircraft, these non-C marked aircraft, and the open category. Section 14, I skipped just a little bit ahead and talk about geographic zones. Again, a concept that you should be aware of. So the regulations introduce the concept of geographic zones, and these are zones that will either permit, restrict or prohibit the flight of unmanned aircraft. And the IAA have taken this on board, and they've produced two major types of geographic zones. Those that concern air risk, and these are the ones that affect air safety, and they'll be located around the major airports. And then we've got non-air risk geographic zones that are not air risk related and might be related to security, privacy and environmental issues. So for any of those reasons, the IAA might restrict or prohibit the flight of unmanned aircraft in Irish airspace. Now, you can find all these limitations in the IAA's Aeronautical Notice U4, and that link to that document is also contained within the handbook. So there will be areas particularly that will affect the open category where, from an air risk point of view, the geozone will restrict or prohibit the flight of open category aircraft. Now, section 12 then of the handbook looks at the open category in particular. So the open category is a low risk category of operation, and it's essentially bounded by a few simple rules. The first is that the maximum weight of an aircraft that can be used in the open category is 25 kgs. And you can only fly visual line of sight operations in the open category. So that means the remote pilot must always be able to see the aircraft when it's airborne. Operations are also limited to a max height of 120 meters, and this helps reduce the air risk and so keep the open category as a low risk operation. But it also, from a ground risk point of view, implements certain minimum horizontal distances that the aircraft must be maintained from uninvolved persons. Now, the extent of the minimum horizontal distance depends on whether you're operating in open A1, A2 or A3. So when it comes to open category operations, that minimum horizontal distance will depend on A1 or A2 or A3, as I said. So A1 is considered a flyover people operation. So there's essentially no minimum horizontal distance that needs to be maintained from uninvolved persons or members of the public. So if you have a legacy aircraft and it weighs less than 500 grams, you could use that aircraft and fly open A1 operations. When the C-marked aircraft are available, C0 and C1 will also be used in the open A1. A3 then is a fly far from places category of operation, which basically says you must keep the aircraft 150 meters horizontally from built-up areas. So residential, commercial, industrial areas, and indeed recreational areas are covered as well. And the legacy aircraft can weigh no more than 500 grams to 25 kgs. So that's quite a restrictive category of operation A3 if you want to operate in the open category under those rules. There is the open A2 category, which is a fly close to people category of operation. And essentially you have to keep a 50-meter horizontal distance from uninvolved persons when you're operating the aircraft. Now, if you're using legacy aircraft that weigh between 500 grams and less than 2 kg, or you're using one of those C2 aircraft when they're available, you could operate in open A2. Again, the little asterisk indicates that there's extra remote pilot competency required to operate in the open A2 category. Now, sections 12.1 of the manual, I introduced the various subcategories of the open category in a bit of detail. So across the top, you'll see the various headings, categories, aircraft types, distance from uninvolved persons, flight over assemblies of people, operating areas, operating airspace, and the pilot competency required. And then the rest of the table then defines all these limitations based on the various aircraft. So if we look to, we're all using legacy aircraft today. So for a transition period up to the 1st of January 2023, we can operate in the open A1 transition category, which is an Article 22 operation. So if your legacy aircraft weighs less than 500 grams, you can fly with no intention of flight overhead people. You can never fly over assemblies of people. Your operating areas can be populated and sparsely populated areas, and your operating airspace can be as defined there. And you would need the A1, A3 remote pilot certificate to fly in that category. So that's how you should use this table as such. After the 1st of January 2023, we are limited by Article 20 operations. So this would essentially mean that if you had a legacy aircraft after the 1st of January 2023, your legacy aircraft can only weigh 250 grams or less, or sorry, less than 250 grams. Okay. So really they want the A1 category, they want you flying C0 or C1 aircraft. But that's how you should use that table. Section 12.2 then just moves into the A2 subcategory. Again, the same headings and that are on the table. Again, because we're all using legacy aircraft today, this A2 transition period row is important. So we're limited by Article 22 operations, which means if we have a legacy aircraft and it weighs between 500 grams and less than 2 kg, we could operate that aircraft under A2 rules. The distance from uninvolved persons is 50 meters. Again, no flight over assemblies of people, and the operating area and operating airspace are the same as A1, but the remote pilot would need the open A2 certificate of competency. After this Article 22 operational period, so from the 1st of January 23, no legacy aircraft can be used in the A2 subcategory. Section 12.3 then is the A3 subcategory. Again, the transition period, legacy aircraft up to 25 kg can be used in subcategory A3 in accordance with Article 22. This time, the distance from uninvolved persons, no uninvolved persons in the flight area, and the flight area must be 150 meters from residential, commercial, industrial, and recreational areas. The pilot competency then is just the A3 proof of online training certificate. A3 then after the 1st of January 23, if the legacy aircraft was placed on the market before the 1st of January 23 and it weighs between 250 grams and less than 25 kg, well then you can operate in open category A3 in accordance with Article 20. Now, section 12.4, there's another table, and this table should be useful to you. So the legacy aircraft that you're using today is listed here. Most of the more popular aircraft I've listed here. So if you find your aircraft in this list, it'll very quickly identify then which subcategory you can operate in. And there's some notes on it. So if we look to a very popular drone that a lot of people would use, the DJI Mavic 2, Mavic 2 Pro or Zoom, or the Mavic Enterprise Advanced, that aircraft could be used in the Open A2 subcategory. Your minimum horizontal distance is 50 meters. The remote pilot must hold the Open A2 certificate, but you can only operate up until the 1st of January 23, and then you must move to Open A3. If your drone isn't listed here, you can look at the legacy unmanned aircraft weight. So based on the weight then of your aircraft that you're using, you can quickly determine which subcategory you could operate in. So just because it's important, the open category then with our legacy aircraft, essentially after the 1st of January 23, your legacy aircraft, if it weighs less than 250 grams, you can operate it in Open A1, which means you can fly overhead people with your drone or very close to them. There's no minimum horizontal distance. Any other legacy aircraft then between 250 grams and less than 25 kg is restricted to the Open A3 category, which means you're quite restrictive in terms of where you can fly because you have to be 150 meters horizontally from those built up areas. Point to note, after that date, no legacy aircraft in Open A2. Another restriction of the open category is in relation to those geographic zones. The open category won't be allowed fly in all geographic zones. So these red geographic zones you see on this map here, there's no open category operations permitted in these prohibited geographic zones. Likewise, you'll see some red ones around there. So local authorities based around those major airports of Donegal, Sligo, Connacht, Shannon, Kerry, Cork, Waterford and Dublin, you should take note of where you can and you can't fly with if you're flying under open category rules. The amber areas represent height restrictions, so currently 15 meters in a lot of these areas. Dublin, a little bit different. The red areas exist as well. Then we've got an amber area there, 30 meter height restriction, and the green area is a 90 meter height restriction for the open category. So just something to bear in mind because the open category is restrictive around those geographic zones that are air risk related. Now, the specific category then, this is a category which allows for more medium to high risk operations. So essentially the easiest way to think about the specific category is it's a category of operation that you need to operate in if you can't do what you want to do legally in the open category. So the risk is essentially increased. So some examples, it's not an exhaustive list, but essentially you might want to fly in the specific category if you want to fly in any of those prohibited or restricted geozones that restrict open category operations. Or if you want to fly those larger aircraft in built up areas that are limited to the Open A3 normally. Or you want to continue to fly legacy aircraft in built up areas after the 1st of January 23. Or maybe you want to do beyond line of sight operations or operate aircraft greater than 25 kg. Or maybe you want to conduct complex operations. So you might want to do some payload delivery for, in the agricultural sector or the other horticultural sectors. So you can't drop any materials from an unmanned aircraft in the open category. Now, the specific category is a risk-based category. So it's your permission to operate is based on a risk assessment. And the risk assessment can take one of two formats. You can use an authority-provided risk assessment. So here's the European Aviation Safety Agency. That agency has done a number of risk assessments known as predefined risk assessments or standard scenarios. Basically, they've risk assessed an operational type, and they've defined then some operational limitations and some technical limitations that if you can live within the restrictions of the authority-provided risk assessment, well, then you can go off and you can conduct your photography and videography and survey missions within the prescribed limitations of their risk assessment. If you're not happy with what they allow under their risk assessment, you're fully okay to write your own risk assessment, except that you must use the specific operations risk assessment tool. You can't use any old red, amber, green risk assessment tool. You have to use this 10-step risk assessment process. So you'll either need to get someone trained up on how to use this risk assessment tool or contract in some consultancy around that. So the specific category is based on a risk assessment to get an approval to operate. Now, the EASA has provided a number of risk assessments, and they're listed there, predefined risk assessments, S01, S2, G01, G02. And this table is designed to tell you briefly, or at a high level, the technical limitations that might apply and the operational limitations that might apply if you're operating under these provided risk assessments. So PDRA S01, I think a lot of local authorities will look to use. It allows you to use aircraft up to 25 kg or with a wingspan less than 3 meters. It'll allow you to fly visual line of sight operations in a controlled ground area, which means there can be no people inside the area that you're flying over, but that area, it can be located in populated and sparsely populated areas. So this gets around the limitation of larger aircraft having to operate under open A3 rules. It's a visual line of sight operation, so it's whatever the maximum range is, whatever the visual line of sight range is, less than 120 meters, and you can, importantly, fly in controlled and uncontrolled airspace, which basically gives you access to those geographic zones that are normally restricted in the open category. So reference to that table will give you an idea of what the different risk assessments that are provided might allow you to do. And if you looked to use one of these risk assessments, there is quite a detailed document that has been written that outlines exactly what you can and you cannot do if you're going to operate under that risk assessment that's provided to you. Now, one thing that is different from the Irish system that any local authorities that are used to operating under the Irish system might find a little bit unusual under the European system is that technical mitigation is an important consideration if you want to conduct operations in the specific category. So the regulations do define some basic technical requirements that an unmanned aircraft must have. And currently, there is a requirement that the aircraft used in the specific category would have an independent means of shutting the motors down in flight in case the primary radio control system fails and a loss of control of the aircraft might result. So this redundant and independent radio system is an added item that you'll need to add to your aircraft that will give the remote pilot the ability to terminate the flight so that they don't lose control of the aircraft and the aircraft doesn't fly off into an area that it was never expected to be in. So that's part and parcel of the process. And those drones you're flying today with DJI, there are third-party equipment and systems that you can affix to your aircraft to meet these requirements. Another aspect that might be important in the specific category is the whole idea of reducing impact dynamics in case an aircraft does crash, and that can mean needing to affix parachute systems to your aircraft. So this is very different and new when compared to the Irish system, and I've consulted with a lot of local authorities over the last number of months and the last few years, and we have introduced with some local authorities these systems already. So they are available, and it's just to make you aware of this fact. If you want to operate in the specific category, you might need to equip your aircraft with these systems. Now, the last few slides here then, just when it comes to remote pilot regulatory training, every remote pilot that wants to operate an unmanned aircraft will need a certain minimum amount of competency. So there are 3 competency levels, A1, A3, A2, and the specific category. So a remote pilot will get a certificate issued with a level of competency based on the course that they complete. And when they have the required competency, then they can operate in either Open A1, A3, Open A2, or indeed in the specific category. Open A3 is conducted by the Irish Aviation Authority. They provide the training for that on their online system, whereas Open A2 and specific category training would take place at DUTOs, Declared Unmanned Aircraft System Training Organisations. These are organisations like my own Safe Drone Academy that are authorised to conduct training by the Irish Aviation Authority. So all remote pilots will need a certain level of competency. IAA themselves are the designated competent authority when it comes to implementing and enforcing the regulations here in Ireland. To that end, the regulations actually specify regulatory responsibilities for the authority. And to that end, the IAA have set up a new online portal. It's known as My SRS, My Safety Regulatory System. It's an online system. And within this system, registration can take place, remote pilot certificates will be issued, and authorizations to operate in the specific category will be issued through this system. So it's important that every remote pilot out there would open an account with My SRS, and the link is within the handbook. It's also there on the screen. It's also very important that, again, local authorities engage with the IAA on this so that the local authority, using the complex organisation process, can be registered manually by the IAA within the My SRS system. So I really can't emphasize enough that local authority management and headquarters need to engage with the IAA to ensure that the local authority can conduct legal operations. Finally, then, the last few sections of the handbook, there's a detailed frequently asked questions section where I've spoken to a number of different county councils around the country, and the basic questions that were asked during those conversations, I've included a few of those, the answers to those frequently asked questions towards the end of the handbook. And then the very last section, I've just completed a kind of a path to operations for both the open category and specific category. So kind of a step-by-step process that local authorities could use to guide them in terms of getting their operations up and running with the IAA registration, getting their permissions to operate under the open or specific category, and then getting their employees, getting the remote pilots trained to the required standard. So if you need any help or consultancy or any training, you'll get myself there at markedsafedrone.ie. That's my email address. I'm happy to speak to anyone. I'm sure there's some of you here today have come across me before, and I've worked with you. We also, there's our website, safedrone.ie, and we're also engaged in consulting. So we help set up operations at an enterprise level or a local authority level as required.